All right, well, folks, it is an enormous pleasure to introduce Dahlia Lithwick to you. I am certain that virtually everybody here knows who she is. For those of you who were watching MSNBC last night and Rachel Maddow, you actually saw Dahlia commenting on Neil Gorsuch, the new Supreme Court nominee from our circuit. Dahlia is a Canadian by birth, has spent a considerable amount of time in Israel over the years. Her father, who was a college professor, took his sabbaticals over there. She is a graduate of Yale University and Stanford University Law School. She has written books. She has written for numerous publications, including Newsweek. She's probably best known at this point for, in addition to her many television appearances, Slate.com, and she writes regular columns. As a matter of fact, her output is prolific, and she also has a podcast now as well, which is just fascinating. Virtually all of her writing tends to deal with legal subjects, but one of the things that's always made it so interesting is that it's much broader than the legal issue that she's looking at. It's taking into account real-world ramifications, the impact on people, and having had a chance to get acquainted with Dahlia to some extent over the past several years, her husband Aaron, who is an architect and sculptor and who unfortunately had to, at the last minute, cancel his trip out here. Her children, Sopher and Kobe, one of whom is a budding thespian, as I recall from our last visit. Anyway, she lives, I think, as busy a life as anybody that I have ever known, and she does it all beautifully. It is an absolute pleasure to introduce to you Dahlia Lithwick.
So I want to start by apologizing on behalf of my husband, Aaron, who really was supposed to present and talk about his artwork today and is just truly, I think, next to me, the biggest fan of Chief Judge Martin in my house, and would have moved mountains to be here. I just want to show you this is a piece he's working on. There you go. He's really deeply sorry he couldn't be here. And I also want to thank Chief Judge Martin for bringing me out, and also for years of friendship that has been amazing to me, because it's a very deep friendship that has helped me think a lot about the remarks I want to make in front of you today. So here's just my little precatory note to you before I begin, and that is I've never given this speech before, and in fact I've never thought about giving this speech before, because it is so off the rails of what journalists usually get to talk about, which is the intersection of faith and the courts and morality and the law. So if I horrify you or myself, we can just pretend this didn't happen. But I can't impress upon you enough, and I hope that you're watching as the conversation about religion in this country becomes incredibly fraught, most recently around the new executive orders around immigration and religion, but just generally a real sense of edging up to what feels like a very angry conversation about faith, that I think that journalists have to get in this fight the same way that judges and lawyers have to get in this fight and figure out a way to take the temperature down. And so I want to start from the proposition that this is a speech I've never given before, because to even talk about this as a journalist or a judge or a lawyer, I think is to step on a multitude of landmines. Nina Totenberg, who covers the Supreme Court for NPR, and the number one question I have gotten in my 17 years of reporting on the Supreme Court has been, do you know Nina? Is she as sexy as she sounds on the radio? And I tell her that all the time because it's her favorite question that anyone ever asks. But when I first told Nina, I think around the time of the Sam Alito confirmation hearings, that I felt that I needed to start to write about the intersection of faith and judging, she told me, absolutely don't. There's no way you can write this article and not anger everyone. And Noah Feldman, who is a Supreme Court scholar and historian, actually told me this is the third rail of American politics, faith. We can more readily talk about sex than we can talk about religion in a deep and probing way. And I will tell you that the one and only time I was called out by a public editor of any publication, and I've written for the New York Times and Newsweek and Commentary, the only time I was asked to apologize for remarks I made about religion was at the time of the Alito hearings, when I said, purely factually, that he would be the fifth Catholic on the court. And that was deemed anti-Catholic bias, and it was deemed so irrelevant a comment that I was asked to apologize, which I wouldn't do. And I think that the problem we have when we talk about faith, whether we're talking about the faith of judges and how it reflects on their doctrine, or more profoundly when we talk about religious cases that not only come to the courts all the time, but that more and more are sort of bound up in doublespeak because we can't talk about faith. I think the central tenet of my remarks to you is that we are the most religious secular country in the world. We are a country that purports to be absolutely encompassing of all faiths and to have a wall between church and state. And also, we are comprised of deeply faithful people. And that is a huge problem because it means you're always talking about a duality that we're not meant to recognize out loud. So I'm going to start by just telling you two secrets, and they're really secrets. The first is that I do believe that one's faith materially affects one's job. And I do believe that one's faith materially affects one's legal propositions and one's legal beliefs. And I even believe that for a judge, one's faith often at least complicates and confounds questions. And that if we cannot say that, that's a problem. My second secret is, and this is the really big secret, I am myself a person of faith, of deep faith. And that faith is such a huge part of who I am that I often feel as though I live a secret life, that I have my journalist life and then I go and have Sabbath with my children and pray at night with them and feel as though I'm in some way being false in both lives. And I think that the only two people who know that religion is as important to me as it is are the second editor I had at Slate for about 4 years. And after about 3 years of editing me, he said, I just realized that you talk about the Constitution the way religious people talk about the Bible. You really believe this? Ew. And I said, I do. I grew up learning Bible text long before I thought about legal text, and I really do believe that the constitutional language is to be read as something that borders on immutable and sacred. And he was horrified, and that's why he's not my editor anymore. The other person who knows that I'm a person of deep faith is the person who wrote the funniest angry hate mail I've ever received in my career. So I have to take you back for a minute to one of my favorite cases, which was Pleasant Grove versus Summum. You may remember it. and it was a religious conflict about whether the sect that was called Summum was allowed to erect religious monuments in Utah. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and everybody on my snarky hip-hop Supreme Court beat was making fun of the religious tenets of this faith that really did believe, in things like aliens, and one of their commandments was everything vibrates, and they believed in blue people, and it seemed rife for Supreme Court journalists to poke fun at their faith. And that seemed an easy way to not talk about the merits. And so I started my article on it by saying, look, everybody wants to make fun of other people's religions and how silly they are, but in my house, when my husband puts a meat fork in the dairy sink, I have to take the meat fork out of the dairy sink and plunge it into a ficus where it must rest for 7 days. And that is just a rule of being kosher. That struck me as an unremarkable proposition. But a very angry reader wrote to the Washington Post and said, look, my wife and I have dirty names for each other's dirty parts, but meat forks and milk sinks isn't okay. And if your disgusting writers want to write about their naughty bits, they should not be allowed to do it in the pages of the Washington Post. Which led my editor at the Post to write the greatest correction letter to hate mail I've ever received, which was, Miss Lithwick has a kosher kitchen. This stuff is true, the editor. So I tell you all this just to say that it is incredibly coded and fraught whenever these issues come up. And I think that every time religious questions come up, particularly on my beat at the Supreme Court, journalists are immediately thrown into a bind, the sort of Nina Totenberg bind of should we just not write about it, and how can we write about this both sensitively but also probingly. And I think that there are 3 options, and they're bad options. The first option is to just openly embrace that, justices have deeply held religious views, and that's okay, and it does not matter at all. And the example I give for that is something like the Red Mass, which is the Mass that happens right before the opening of the Supreme Court term, and the justices go, and they are often excoriated about doctrinal matters, such as abortion, and told what's right and what's wrong from a very religious viewpoint, so much so that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who does not have a milk sink and a meat sink, but is of the Jewish faith, just doesn't go anymore, just stopped going because it made her so uncomfortable, although Justice Breyer, who is Jewish, continues to go. And we don't know how to cover the Red Mass as a press pool. I used to cover it for a few years. I thought it was a strange custom. I didn't know how I felt about it. And then I just stopped covering it because it just felt like you're either calling out something that looks wrong or being a hater, and there was no space to talk reasonably about what, if anything, was wrong with that. The other alternative, it seems to me, is to just excoriate people of faith for being faithful and imposing it onto doctrine, and I think that's impossible and intolerable. I don't think that it makes any sense, and we saw a lot of this in the Little Sisters of the Poor case, where journalists were just going after religious adherents. And that serves no utility, and it strikes me as absolutely moving us in the wrong direction. I think the third alternative for a reporter is to insist that it just doesn't matter and we don't have to talk or think about this in a critical way. And I always think of Justice Scalia, who was openly very, very proud of his faith and who exhorted other Catholics to live as he did, to be, as he said, fools for Christ, and to also say that it in no way affects your jurisprudence and that we should take everyone on faith, that there is a kind of, religion in the workplace and religion at home, and they're 2 utterly different things. And it seems to me that that's a very credulous approach for journalists to take, particularly journalists who are being asked to think critically about where doctrine comes from. So it seems to me, and this is where I come to you with my questions, that we have a responsibility in the media to do better than any of those options, to either critically and ragefully accuse people of being of faith, or to ignore their faith, or to pretend that there's no conversation to be had. And I think that none of those are the way forward, particularly now, as matters of faith are going to be important. I think we have a responsibility to do this in a deeply respectful way. And I think we have a responsibility to call out the strange dualism that absolutely is woven into all the legal doctrine around religion that suggests that this is a secular / Christian / Judeo-Christian / atheist / something else country without defining where the line is. So I want to ask you, because I was once told if you don't have opinions on a subject, ask questions. So I want to ask you some questions, and maybe in our Q&A you can help me think through what the answers are. But I also want to say, as an advisory matter, that we are about to head into the hearings for Judge Gorsuch, who has written so deeply and solicitously about faith, and who has very, very, I think, much put his faith into his writing on doctrine, that if we don't figure out how we're going to have that conversation in his hearing, we are going to have an incredibly partisan and polarized conversation about religion in America at exactly a moment that we are having a very, I think, polemical and dangerous conversation about Islam in America. And I think to not reckon with the fact that these are problems that are two sides of the same coin, and that talking respectfully in a confirmation hearing about one person's faith requires talking respectfully in the policy forum about faith, to not understand that that is the same problem, I think is really to go forward in this discussion at our peril. So here is my series of questions for you. And I think the first one is as follows. I covered the Jeff Sessions hearing 2 weeks ago. If you were watching on C-SPAN, that was me playing solitaire on my computer. I was actually playing solitaire on my computer. But I perked up about 3 in the afternoon on the first day of Senator Sessions' confirmation hearings, when he was in a colloquy that I thought was a pretty respectful colloquy with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. And Senator Whitehouse had pulled up some speeches that Senator Sessions had made about the role of faith. Sessions had denigrated Sotomayor explicitly for her secular views, and had suggested in some speeches that lawyers who were not believers, in his words, secular lawyers, would have a harder time finding the truth of any matter. And Senator Whitehouse said, you can't possibly be saying, can you, Senator, that in your Justice Department you would even think about purging people who were secular. You can't possibly be saying right now that people who are not religious people have a harder time getting to the truth. And there was a long, really a long, awkward pause, and then Senator Sessions answered, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I'm not saying that. And he really was unable to disaggregate his feeling that people of faith somehow have a lock on truth that secular lawyers do not have. And certainly that colloquy ended leaving open at least the question of whether it might be somewhere in soon-to-be Attorney General Sessions' mind that maybe we could do away with non-religious lawyers in the Justice Department. And nobody knew how to write the story. It was such a strange moment and such a strange story and such a strange accusation to be leveling that almost nobody reported it. And even when we reported it, and I did report it, nobody knew what to say about it, Nobody knew what to say, whether this was just a strange blip or whether, in fact, we should be looking down the road to some kind of religious tests or purges in the Justice Department. So my question for you is, what should we have done, and how could we have talked about that? My second question for you is in the Town of Greece case that just had to do with prayer before town meetings. And it's a long-standing problem, and it goes all the way back to Kansas versus Marsh, and we don't quite know what the rule is supposed to be beyond the fact that the court has said that sectarian religious prayer is okay sometimes as long as it's not too religious. And you all know as well as I do that finding that line is preposterous, and that the courts have done crazy lambada-like dancing to try to skirt actually finding that line. But to me, the most interesting thing about the Town of Greece opinion as it came down from the Supreme Court was that it cleaved perfectly along religious lines, and that the Catholic justices all said there's nothing wrong with this sectarian prayer policy in this town, even though it's been expressly of one faith for many years. And the Jewish justices and Sonia Sotomayor, who is Catholic but I think secular, all came down on the other side and said, of course there's something wrong with this. And it wasn't simply that it fractured on religious lines. That would have been interesting enough. But the language around the majority opinion was so intriguing to me, because it was sort of this lofty aspirational notion of religion as a fundamentally civilizing thing that brings us all together. And Justice Kennedy's view of, okay, it's explicitly Christian prayer, but doesn't it make us all better to just hear that before a legislative session? Isn't it just, in the end of the day, something that heightens all of our experience and reminds us what our values are? And at one level, of course, it's true, but it can only be said by someone for whom explicitly Christian prayer is aspirational and civilizing. And Elena Kagan, who is so careful as a jurist to never write about herself, wrote a dissent in that case that was absolutely about herself and absolutely about what it's like to be a religious minority who feels as though they are being excluded from a discourse that says, oh, come on, religious minorities, just suck it up. It's a couple of minutes, you'll be better off for it. Come on, play nicely. And she really felt, I think viscerally, that she was being excluded from an important conversation. And I often read her dissent in that case as a really emblematic Kagan moment of showing who she really, really is. How should we have covered that? I wasn't sure. In my coverage of that case, I think I wrote that we have to be very careful when we say that a little bit of sectarian religion is ennobling for all of us, because it's not necessarily ennobling for all of us, and for some people it's quite terrifying. And more fundamentally, some sectarian religion is really frightening to many of us, and that the idea that some religion makes us better and more loving and more open-hearted, but some other religions make us fierce and dangerous, I think is a very frightening proposition. And the reader mail I got on that was incredibly incandescent with anger. The notion that religion doesn't make us all better, as long as it's a kind of diluted religion that is just a little bit sectarian, really, really offended readers. And I think there is this notion, and I very unfairly call it Sandra Day O'Connor's Teddy Ruxpin case, where, she always says that a creche isn't really a creche if you throw a teddy bear in there. Then it's just a nice place for teddy bears with some religious symbols around it. And I think that can't possibly be what we aspire to when we talk about faith in this country. That we have deeply religious people who have to accept that as long as you throw a teddy bear in there, or something that civilizes it, then it's okay and sanitized for everyone. Because that's ultimately both insulting for people of faith and insulting for non-believers. It seems like the worst way through. And I think what Elena Kagan was trying to express in her Town of Greece dissent was that what you think is just sort of the teddy bear in the town hall sectarian prayer is actually simply just covering over the fact that I'm not welcome here. The other thing I wanted to ask is about how I should have covered the Little Sisters case when it came to the court last year. Because it was an amazing moment as a journalist, and none of us wrote this. And I think unless you were in the chamber, you didn't see it. But when the Little Sisters case was argued at the Supreme Court last year, there were rows and rows of nuns and Dominican friars and Franciscan monks, all of them in full array of their religious garb. And it was an astonishing moment at the Supreme Court, one that I had never seen the likes of. And I didn't report that piece of color, and I don't think anyone else did. Because, again, nobody wanted to make fun, no one wanted to belittle, but it was an incredible thing that none of us felt that we could talk about the mood in the room and how different it is when half of the room is a person of faith that you yourself, as a journalist, may see as a religious leader. How should we have talked about that? And what was the answer? And thank God there are no cameras in the courts, because I assure you that Jon Stewart would have had a field day with the Monty Python-like appearance of, rows and rows and rows of religious people and nobody talking about it. But we didn't do it right, and I'm not sure how we're going to fix that. And the last question I have to ask you is this. I am worried, as a journalist, that the creeping ontological question of, is a person really X? How can you know? You can't know they're really a racist, or you can't know that they're really sexist, because I know what's in their heart. And that's the conversation we've been having for the past year. And we certainly had it, I think, at the Jeff Sessions confirmation hearing, that it didn't matter what actions he had taken or what words he had spoken. It didn't matter about his career, either as a prosecutor or as a judge or as a senator. What mattered was what was in his heart. And we keep hearing this discourse more and more used to dispute facts. And I think that as judges and lawyers, it's so strange to hear that the entire evidentiary record can be wiped out by the assertion that you don't know this person. It's what's in her heart that matters. And it strikes me as very much the language of faith. It's not the language of fact or proof. It's the language of belief. And it's also the language of you have a relationship with some higher power that somehow obviates everything else you've ever done in your life. And I'm absolutely worried as a journalist that if we are losing facts at the same time that we are grasping this cardiologic model of morality, that all that matters is what's in their heart, then we are losing the framing for how we talk about right and wrong and how we talk about facts. And so my question is, as a journalist, when confronted with, and I assure you that Senator Sessions had panels of character witnesses willing to say, I know what's in his heart. This is a good person. There is nothing that anyone can do or write or say to undermine that. And if really the only search we are now having as a country is for what is in people's hearts in order to serve, then we should just really do, I guess we're just going to have to do scans of their internal organs in lieu of having meaningful conversations around what they do and what they think and believe. So it seems to me that as long as the narrative continues to be that faith matters deeply and we can't talk about it, and that people of faith are under siege and we can't talk about it, then we are really, in a deep way, becoming the opposite of what I think our First Amendment wants to protect with the religious freedom protections. And I want to just close this part of my remarks by telling you that I think that the fact that I am whispering this speech to you in secret after 17 years of being somebody who is really quite publicly closed off about matters of faith, that I think we need to find language very quickly for how we are going to do better. And a few weeks ago, I heard the Reverend Dr. William Barber, who is in North Carolina, the architect of the Moral Mondays movement, and who has been, I think, trying very hard to talk about faith in ways that transcend sectarian faith. And I heard him give a speech to 1,200 of the most jaded secular attorneys that I have ever seen in San Francisco. I mean, piercings and tattoos, and not necessarily receptive to a deeply, deeply faithful Christian talking about how to reclaim faith. And what seemed to me to be the cornerstone of what he was talking about was reconnecting the language of religion with the language of morality, which is something we're not doing very well right now in our discourse. And more profoundly, I think what he's talking about is a gentling of the conversation around faith in this country, using faith not to say you're in, you're out, you're good, you're bad, you need to be excoriated for your values, but the commonality of faith, not the Teddy Ruxpin commonality that says that one faith makes us all better, but the kind of faith that says, ultimately, we all pretty much want the same things most of the time. And how do we figure out a policy and a legal framework to put that into work? And it seems to me that that is the project, rather than the project of completely denying that faith is a part of who we are. And so my feeling is that I'm going to pledge to you here to do a better job of both reclaiming a sort of gentle faith and a faith of commonality, and trying to, I think, go forward without that feeling of with us and against us that really, I think, has been a marker for journalists in talking about faith. But I also think I need to understand, and this is where I'm hoping you all are going to have smart insights for me, how it is possible that if most of us believe at least some things, some of the time, that we have become very, very quickly a country that is as divided and angry and polarized around questions of faith as we are. And so I want to thank you so much for spending the morning in this dubious enterprise with me. And I want you to come to my house when you're in Charlottesville, because we have both a meat sink and a milk sink. Thank you very much. And if you don't want to ask questions about this, then we can just gossip about the Supreme Court. That's totally fine too. Does anyone have, that was a big existential question. Yeah.
And I thank you for it. I thank you for being vulnerable here with us today. It seems like, and agreeing to break 17 years of silence on this very interesting and important topic, it seems like religion is often treated by the media elite as kind of like, we're forward, we are writing that the enemy's coming, and they do it when traditionalists seem to be gaining ground. And I'm hearing a little bit of that this morning. For example, Brooklyn Law School, Sotomayor, Justice Sotomayor, May of 2016, she said there's a disadvantage having 5 Catholics and 3 Jews on the Supreme Court. You hear almost nothing of that. At the same time she says that, Merrick Garland is awaiting confirmation in the Senate to go on the High Court. He's Jewish. I didn't know that.
Nobody knew that. I'm not sure his wife knew that. Yeah.
Most of us didn't know that because we were warned by the watchdogs like you. But had he been a traditional Catholic, we would have been told.
Mm-hmm. So you think it's a one-way ratchet where this is a sort of anti-Catholic, and that it wouldn't have been. I mean, it certainly was pointed out that he was Jewish, but you're saying that there's this sort of warning, this warning aspect about being Catholic, which, is,
Show me a liberal who's been borked. I'll sit down.
well, borked. Show a liberal who's been borked. I mean, I would say there's a liberal who's been worse than borked, and that's Merrick Garland, who didn't get a hearing. But I don't want to. No. Please, like, we are being vulnerable here, so I think probably going at each other is not the way to do it. I think that on the Catholic question, it's an enormous problem, and it's an irony because for the longest time at the Supreme Court, there was one Catholic seat. You couldn't have two Catholics at the court. It was so outrageous. And then for a very long time at the court, there was one Jewish seat. And so I think that a little bit of the fascination with all these Jews and Catholics on the court is because they couldn't get on it. For most of history, it was largely a Protestant court. And so I think a little bit of what you're hearing is very much about those two religions now having come to dominate the court. But I do think undergirding your question is a really important question, and I want to treat it with huge respect because I've thought about it a lot. I think that the reason there is a question about whether the Catholic justices can do justice and disaggregate their views from their doctrine, and there's less of that conversation around the Jewish justices, is only because I think the flashpoints of the culture wars seem to be capital punishment, abortion. In other words, I think they seem to be things on which it's very clear where the church stands, and there's not a really good, deep Jewish jurisprudence of abortion or capital punishment. And so I think it might have less to do with an anti-Catholic animus and more to do with the issues that became the sort of pillars of the culture wars. And I think the other reason that there's such a laser focus on the Catholic justices and the places that their doctrine is enmeshed is because probably the single most important law review article on this subject was written by Justice Scalia, who really, I think, wanted to put this question into evidence by writing in the journal in First Things. I think just a signal piece of religious philosophical inquiry into how he separates his Catholic faith from his jurisprudence. And I commend it to you if you are interested at all in this topic, because it's not, a sort of fatuous, like, oh no, it's not a problem. He's clearly struggling. And the place where he was struggling most deeply was that he broke with the Catholic orthodoxy on the death penalty. And when the Catholic Church decided that they opposed the death penalty and he still was for it, he had to really do soul searching in a deep way, both as a Catholic and as a jurist, to figure out where he stood on it. And so I think, in a way, that became the lodestar for anyone who writes about this issue of faith and justices. You start with Justice Scalia, and that may at least a little bit explain why we're so focused on, and you probably know this because I can see you've thought about it, but Jeffrey Stone at Chicago Law School wrote a pretty scorching essay saying explicitly what you're saying, that we need to talk about the fact that there are all these Catholics on the court because this shapes abortion doctrine. And to not talk about it is to elide what he thinks is this constitutional crisis. And Justice Scalia was so angry at Jeff Stone's writing on that he refused to go back to Chicago Law School for years. And they, really broke over this. So that this is an incredibly raw nerve is not in dispute. I'm not sure I accept your fundamental premise that we go after Catholics in a way that we don't go after other religions. I think that it is certainly the case that that is the framing that has existed, and I think that may be because of these hot-button issues that are in a way really in conflict with Catholic doctrine and not in conflict right now with Jewish doctrine. So I hope that's my respectful answer, but I absolutely don't dispute that we, in writing about religion generally, the members of the Supreme Court press corps, the regular press corps, are not respectful of anyone's religion. Anyone else have thoughts or questions?
Any member of a religion accepts all of the doctrine. And I think the press has taken, thank you. I think the press has taken a shorthand way of saying this person is pro-abortion or anti-abortion by labeling them with a religion. I have Catholic friends who, are not against abortion. So maybe it's the assumptions, the implicit assumptions that we put in these labels. And maybe the press can help us by spending more time telling all of us, educating all of us about how similar the beliefs of all of the religions are, so that we don't fear each other.
I love the assumption there, because whenever I get an angry mail from a judge, present company notwithstanding, but whenever I get an angry mail for a judge, it's about the convention we have in journalism that any judge is immediately identified by who appointed them, and that's the marker, right? That tells you everything you need to know. Bush appointee, done. Clinton appointee, got it. Don't need to say anything else. And it's reductive in exactly the way you're describing. It assumes that these things are shorthands that tell you everything you need to know about who that judge is. I hate that convention, and I in fact almost never use it for exactly the reason you're describing, because it imputes beliefs onto that judge that are not necessarily there. I will say, I think that it doesn't help when, for instance, Hobby Lobby comes down or Town of Greece comes down on exactly these lines. In other words, I am happy to do the work of saying, Sonia Sotomayor is a Catholic, and she clearly is not the same kind of Catholic as Anthony Kennedy, who is not the same kind of Catholic as Clarence Thomas. And I think that's important work. But the fact that we keep seeing it break this way is not helpful. So I think part of the problem is, I often say, when people ask me about the R&D question, about judges, and they say this is very, very reductive and not helpful to look at judges through a political lens. And I always say, look, courts are completely apolitical except when they're not. And I think that judges are completely areligious except when they're not, which is not at all helpful to answer your question. But I think that we have to, certainly you're correct, do a better job of unpacking what that means, but also understand that sometimes it is revelatory and important, and try to find that space and that subtlety you're looking for. Yeah.
My view is that in America, religion is a mile wide and an inch deep. Foundation principle of religion is that men and women are created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God, and yet a despicable acts of religious bigotry have recently been perpetrated in this country. And I don't hear the outrage about that. And the issue, you're talking, in kind of theoretical terms, but we have a situation where religious bigotry is at the forefront of a new president, and that's the real issue here. And if people don't speak out against that form of religious bigotry, then I don't think their religion is very deep.
I think there are probably a lot of people in this room who share your view that we have a real, I think we have a very, very pernicious conversation going right now about religious bigotry, and I have never seen, ever in my life, I was just covering a story as I walked in the room of somebody who was taken off a plane and questioned, who was not from one of the 7 countries, and the reason that he was held was because he had a Muslim prayer app on his phone, and the border officials pulled him off a plane. So I am in no way going to minimize how worrisome I think the current religion discourse is. I think what I do want to take issue with in your statement is the idea that it's a mile wide and an inch deep, because my experience of it is that it is not. For the people for whom it is deep, it is very, very deep, and that what I don't want to do is denigrate or disrespect people for whom faiths, including faiths that I don't share, are determinative of every part of their worldview and philosophy. I think it's not helpful to say that they don't deeply have religion or that they don't deeply feel religion. And so I think what I'm trying to do in trying to initiate this conversation about how we're going to do this publicly is figure out a way to say it is in all of our interests, and I think the framers would agree, that we not have religious tests, that we not have religious bans, that we not have a discourse that's rooted in antipathy for one religion to the other. I think that that's, to me, stipulated, but I think that the next thing has to be, if we can't talk about this in respectful ways rather than really divisive and dangerous ways, I think we are going backward on this conversation and not forward. I think I have time. Do I have time for another question? Is that? Last one. Okay, I'm getting the hook. Who are you pointing at? Someone? Yes. Oh, okay. Yes.
You have not mentioned the whole question of those people in this country that have no religion, that are atheists, or fit in, as I understand, the fastest growing category when you try and figure out who's in what category. How does that fit with your thoughts about religious people?
It's such a good question, and it's one I struggle with because, as I'm sure you all know, the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, which is really a thing, Google it, has become the representative in these town of Greece style cases, right? The first people who wanted to go in and lead religious services before legislative meetings after town of Greece is the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, and other very, very, I think, sort of silly, parodic religions that are trying to sort of disrespectfully denigrate other faiths. And so it is a good question, and I say it's problematic for me because unlike some of my secular colleagues, I actually can't cheer when fake religions, try to set themselves up as opponents of religious rights by completely, I think, undermining what I think are the important things that religions bring to the table. And so I haven't written a worshipful profile of the Flying Spaghetti Monster Church, although I like spaghetti. So I think that your question is the right one, because one thing that the Pew study showed that came out 2 years ago is that the number of secular Americans is growing and the number of atheist Americans is growing. And so certainly, and that this would be in response, I think, to your initial question, the fact that there are 8, soon to be 9 religious Americans on the court is not reflective of who we are. And when Michael Newdow was arguing the Pledge of Allegiance case at the Supreme Court a few years ago, and he had the temerity to say he was arguing pro se, and he was extremely funny. He had the temerity to say not only could a secular person never get elected to Congress, they could never even get onto this court. And everybody in the gallery laughed uproariously because they knew that a secular person couldn't get onto the court. And the justices were stony-faced because they didn't think that was a funny joke at all. And Newdow lost, which proves there is a God. But I think that, you're right that the sort of bulge of the population that is secular is growing, and I think some of the media elites that you're talking about really are reflective of that trend. But I think that in response to that, religious parochialism and outrage has only grown in response. So I think even though the balance of religious to secular Americans has shifted in this country, I think that the energy and enthusiasm has not shifted. And in fact, I think there's a real feeling of religious persecution on the part of a lot of religious groups. And so the demographics may not bear out what I'm saying, but I think that the fact that in terms of policy, religion is as important as ever, and now I think in this moment in history with this president, religion is going to be more important than ever. I think the fact that most Americans are secular is not necessarily going to be material to policy going on, and that's why I think we have to continue to have this conversation in a much more respectful and understanding way. I want to thank you. I know this was weird, but I learned a lot. Thank you so much.